Hey, we wanted to give you a little update here on our series on Titus. If you're looking for week one sermon, unfortunately, we were having some technical difficulties. We're not able to get it recorded, but we wanted to make sure that if you did miss it, that you're up to date with where we are, as we're going to be continuing in the weeks to come in the rest of the book of Titus. And so we wanted to give you just a quick overview of what was said in the first week here of Titus chapter 1, so that you understand the context before we continue on. Titus is a book that's written to the person of Titus, from the person of Paul. And Titus had been an apprentice with Paul and had been asked to stay in Crete to work with the churches there. And so Paul is writing to him, and verse 5 of chapter 1 really gives us a good understanding of what the purpose is of this book and why Titus has been left behind. And it says, "The reason I left you in Crete was that you might put in order what was left unfinished, and appoint elders in every town as I directed you." Titus was left in the place of Crete to help, as it says, to put things in order, and to help to finish what was left unfinished. Now, if you read in verses 10 through 16 of chapter 1, it gives you a lot of context and understanding about what or where Crete was, who the people were, and why there was a need for things to be put in order. See, Crete, you could say, was kind of the Las Vegas of that type of day. It was a very corrupt place with corrupt people, and in those verses 10 through 16, the people of Crete are described as being rebellious people. They're described as being liars, that they're evil brutes, that they're gluttons. And so obviously not very nice things, but these aren't just Paul's words. These are actually words from one of the philosophers of that day in Crete, talking about their very own people. And this is how they were explained. This is how their character was defined. If you were to be called a Cretan, you were very much known to be a liar. And so as you can see, it was a very corrupt place that was in need of a lot of correction. But not just the people of Crete, it was also the church in Crete as well, and a lot of the believers that had started to fall away from God, and a lot of this corruption that was in Crete started to come into the church. And you can see that again in verses 10 through 16 as Paul talks about these false teachers. And he as well talks about them as being disruptive and being rebellious. These were words that were used to describe people that were claiming again to be followers of Christ, but were really living very much different. It says in verse 16, they claim to know God, but their actions deny him. And so the business that Titus was left to do was really to set the church back in order, as it was starting to look really no different than people in Crete who were not following God. There was no difference between the believers and the unbelievers. And so Paul is saying to Titus, there is a need to finish what we have started. These churches that we planted, we really need to start to build them back up and bring them back to what they should. The question that we really reflected on this past weekend was, how do we live right in this world when the society around us speaks a very different message? Can you, as you hear about Crete and you hear about the church, you can see how it's relevant to us today, because it very much talks about and relates to our culture, who we are and what is happening around us. There is a lot of corruption. There is a lot of things within the church as well that are not right, and there is a need to put things in order. And so Titus very much relates to us here today. And Paul gives Titus two very clear instructions on how to begin to do that. And we're going to look at this right living throughout the weeks to come. But in chapter 1, Paul already gives Titus a few steps on how to set right the things that had been off course, or the things that were moving in the wrong direction. He gives them, if you will, a course correction. The place that he starts with that is by defining what the truth is. You see, we can't start with behavior. We have to start with the truth. If we start with behavior, Christianity itself becomes nothing more than a list of rules, of do's and don'ts. The place that we need to begin, and the place that Paul starts, verses 1 through 4, and I encourage you to read those, is defining the truth. The truth is so important. The truth of what we know to be the gospel. The gospel that we are sinners, that we are separated from God, that apart from Him we cannot be made right, and that we cannot live right in this world and stand before God. But because God sent His Son, all because of what He did for us, we can be saved and have that everlasting life, which verse 1 through 4 talks about. Gospel proclamation needs to start before gospel application. That was the most important thing that Paul said, and that he'll continue to say through the chapters to come. We need to proclaim the truth and know the truth, because truth influences my behavior. Truth influences who I am. Behavior doesn't determine truth. Truth determines behavior. We have to begin with the truth. There'll be a link for a video as well that you can check out about the truth, and you'll see how easily truth can be twisted upside down, how it can be twisted around, and that's what was happening here. People were adding to the truth. They were twisting it. They were making it to be what it was not. And so Paul redefines and reestablishes and reminds them what the truth is. Because when we truly know what the gospel is, when we truly know the transforming truth of Jesus and the gospel, that is when we begin to live right. I can't live right in this world, in a society that says something different, if I don't know for myself what the truth is. Do you know the truth? And then secondly, Paul says to appoint elders. And there it's very easy for us to think, well, this just applies to leadership. There's nothing here for me because I'm not an elder. And we're quick to tune it out. But let me say this. We can't know well if something is functioning as it should or functioning properly if we don't know how it is to function, if we don't know the instructions for it. The same is true of the church and the leadership and its elders. We don't ever know if the church is functioning as it should if we don't know the instructions for the church or for its elders. And so these instructions, yes, are for elders, but also for us. And they're also an encouragement to all of us to say, this is the standard that we should all be working towards. But remember, it's not just do these things. It's do these things in response to the truth of God that we learn about in verses 1 through 4. And so in those verses 5 through 9, we hear about what it is to be an elder and what characteristics should be prevalent. And without going into each of those, just let me give you two practical things we took away from that on Sunday of what is said there. The first of which is get under God's authority. See, the false teachers, the Cretans, what we read about in 10 through 16, they were operating on their own authority, under their own authority, making their own decisions apart from God. An elder, someone who is living in the truth, who knows the doctrine and is living in light of that, is living under God's authority, under what God has called us to, and submitting to what it is that He has for us. And when we live under God's authority, there's freedom in life. That sounds a little bit odd, authority and freedom. They don't seem to go hand in hand too often. But really, when we are under God's authority, there is true freedom. We're not slaves to other things in life. The second, be part of community. Those verses about elders talk about the importance of not doing leadership or church or Christianity on our own. It's not meant to be a Lone Ranger thing, because in that there can be corruption. We can twist things. We can start to live by our own standard because there's no one else holding us to accountability or no one else to watch and to do life with. Titus and these instructions call us again to the importance of community. And that's what really a lot of Scripture is reminding us that we are one body. One of my favorite places in Scripture is John 17, when Jesus prays for His disciples. And it's right before His crucifixion. And in that prayer, His prayer is that they would be unified. And they'd be unified, He says, that people would come to know Christ. There's such an important part of us being unified as a body and working together, beyond just our own relationships. But it communicates to the world who God is, His saving grace, and the truth and the gospel. Again, as they see community, they begin to know the truth. And truth is what we need in order to see right living take place. So live in community with other believers. So where does right living happen? How does it happen in light of a society that preaches something differently? Well, we begin to see a few things. First, discover and know the truth. Let that be the driving factor for you. Don't start with behavior. Gospel proclamation has to precede gospel application. Secondly, get under God's authority. And thirdly, live in community with other believers and be unified with one another. This is how Titus starts. I look forward in the coming weeks to continuing to dig into chapter 2 and chapter 3 with all of you. Thanks.